Welcome to Sleepy Tales, a place where myths, legends, and ancient stories are told slowly and softly to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Before we begin, I'd love for you to share where you're from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and if you enjoy relaxing stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a night of our peaceful tales. Now, settle in, relax, and allow tonight's bedtime story carry you into sleep.
In today's Greek mythology story, we dive headfirst into the emotional grenade that is Ares, the god of war, bad decisions, and unchecked testosterone. Ares didn't just represent violence, he was violence. This sleep story explores how Ares managed to sabotage every romantic relationship he encountered, was universally disliked by both gods and mortals, and still managed to become a mythological icon. In the beginning, there was Hera, and Hera was tired of Zeus, tired of his wandering lightning bolt, and particularly tired of being the divine embodiment of marriage, while her husband treated fidelity like a buffet. Take one of everything and don't ask questions. So, in an act of spite, feminism, or perhaps just divine boredom, Hera decided to produce a child all by herself. No need for Zeus, no need for flirtation, and certainly no need for the traditional Olympian courtship ritual, which usually involved at least one bull transformation and light kidnapping. She simply willed Ares into existence, as one does when trying to win an argument through childbirth. It was a powerful moment of independence, a symbolic act of divine agency, and like many symbolic acts, it yielded catastrophic results. Ares arrived not as a peaceful miracle or radiant hope, but as a squalling bundle of unfiltered rage. He cried louder than any other godling, broke his first rattle in a fit of divine wrath, and began kicking before he learned walking. Hera had aimed for balance and justice. She got a walking tantrum with deltoids. From the moment he emerged, it was clear that Ares would not be invited to many family picnics. While other divine children exhibited charm, intellect, or at least moderate self-awareness, Ares's most defining feature was his ability to knock over sacred furniture just by entering the room. He had the emotional range of a wounded bear and the tactical foresight of a rock. Hera, to her credit, tried. For about 5 minutes, she introduced him to toys made of celestial bronze. He broke them. She arranged playdates with other young gods. He tackled them. She briefly considered sending him to Mount Olympus daycare, but they had a strict "no children who bite through armor" policy. Still, the maternal instinct flickered on. Hera hoped that perhaps Ares's combative tendencies were simply a phase. Maybe once he learned to speak, he would express himself with words rather than uppercuts. He did eventually speak. His first word was destroy, not mommy, not Zeus, not even snack, destroy. Ares was, in short, not a people person, not a god person either. His natural response to affection was suspicion, and his reaction to rules was violence. He never met a boundary he didn't want to headbutt. The other Olympians quickly learned to keep their distance. Athena, born fully armed and far more emotionally balanced, regarded Ares with the same enthusiasm one reserves for a fire in the neighbor's yard. Poseidon made a half-hearted attempt to teach him fishing. Ares stabbed the ocean. Apollo tried music therapy. Ares broke the lyre. Dionysus once offered him wine. Ares smashed the cup and declared war on grapes. Despite his enthusiasm for destruction, Ares was not particularly clever. His strategic mind functioned more like a sledgehammer than a chessboard. If something didn't move, he hit it. If it did move, he chased it and then hit it. Plans were for cowards, so were second thoughts. His presence on Mount Olympus became less a divine blessing and more of a liability. Statues cracked when he walked by. Storms gathered for no reason. Peace treaties mysteriously burst into flames. The fates themselves looked at his life thread and shrugged, as if to say, "We tried." Zeus, technically his father, expressed interest in Ares' upbringing only when things exploded, which, to be fair, was often. But even Zeus found Ares' approach a bit too much. This, coming from a god who once turned into a swan for romantic reasons, was saying something. The Olympians attempted interventions. They tried giving Ares titles: Lord of the Spear, Champion of Courage, Defender of Olympus. He responded by engraving Stabber in Chief into his helmet and challenging the sun to a duel. He lost, of course. It's very difficult to punch photons. Eventually, they gave him a room at the edge of Olympus, far from the others, padded with celestial marble and heavily soundproofed. There, he trained with himself, glowered at nothing, and occasionally yelled into the void for no discernible reason. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was containment, a sort of divine quarantine for volatile masculinity. Despite his social shortcomings, Ares did develop a certain aesthetic. He had the look down: blood-red plumes, armor with aggressive shoulder pads, and an aura of simmering rage that made small animals faint. If nothing else, Ares understood branding. He looked like war. He smelled like war. He spoke like war. Short sentences, a lot of yelling, and a complete lack of verbs. But appearances, as always, can only take you so far. Ares lacked the strategic brilliance of Athena, the transformative charm of Hermes, or even the passive-aggressive spite of Artemis. His only skill was destruction, and even that he approached with the finesse of a drunken rhino in a pottery shop. The humans, predictably, were divided on him. Warriors prayed to him before battle, then switched to Athena once they realized they preferred winning. Kings commissioned statues of Ares as a show of strength, then quietly relocated them to the back garden after one too many invasions. He was honored, yes, but mostly out of fear, like a volcano or taxes. Still, mortals gave him offerings, mostly sharp things, bloody things, or things on fire. Ares didn't mind. Appreciation, even in the form of charred goats, was better than being ignored. His temples were few, but intense, the kind of place you'd expect to find rusty altars and extremely questionable incense. His priests were often former soldiers or people who flunked out of hospitality school. Unlike the other gods, Ares didn't bother cultivating a personality. He had no riddles, no poetry, no festivals involving fruit. His only holiday involved two neighboring villages beating each other with sticks. The winner received an official nod from a statue that may or may not have been looking in their direction. He did, however, gain a few followers in the underworld. Not the respectable dead, mind you, but the kind of spirits who muttered to themselves and tried to bite the ferryman. They viewed Ares as a kindred spirit, angry, misunderstood, and extremely fond of pointy objects. Hades himself remained unimpressed. He preferred order. Ares brought none. Just an endless cycle of yelling, stabbing, and dramatic exits. One suspects Hades would have banned him from the underworld altogether if it didn't risk provoking another one-man riot. Even Ares' own children took after him in the worst ways. Phobos and Deimos, twin embodiments of panic and terror, followed him like storm clouds with trust issues. They giggled when cities burned. Harmonia, ironically named, was a rare attempt at balance, though given her father, she spent most of her time issuing apologies on his behalf. By the end of his first divine millennium, Ares had firmly established himself as the least subtle god in the pantheon. He never used 10 words when 2 angry grunts would do. He never took the scenic route if the wall was an option, and he certainly never considered that diplomacy might be faster than invasion. He was, in a word, exhausting. But to be fair, he was consistent. In a world of shape-shifting deities, inconsistent morals, and deeply confusing family trees, Ares never wavered. He was war. Messy, loud, unfiltered war. And while no one particularly liked him, they couldn't quite ignore him either. Because for all their divine wisdom, even the Olympians understood. Sometimes, when all else fails, you need a very large hammer and someone willing to swing it at the wrong time, in the wrong direction, for the wrong reasons. And for that, there was always Ares. There comes a time in every god's life when one must settle into a role, a divine function, if you will. Apollo had music, medicine, and sunburns. Hermes had trade, theft, and interpretive dance. Even Dionysus, the god of seasonal blackouts, had wine. But Ares, with all the subtlety of a flaming chariot crash, found himself pigeonholed into a singular profession, war. He did not audition for it. He did not attend a career fair. He simply showed up, grunted at the concept of diplomacy, and began swinging a sword until someone wrote it down in an official scroll. Thus, Ares became the Olympian god of war. Not clever war, not necessary war, just war in its purest, least refined form, noisy, disorganized, emotionally unstable, and usually shirtless. Unlike Athena, who managed warfare like a chess grandmaster with a clipboard, Ares preferred the battlefield equivalent of flipping the board and setting it on fire. Strategy was for people who liked to wait. Ares liked to charge. If an enemy happened to be where he charged, all the better. If not, well, he charged anyway. Walls, livestock, terrain, he didn't discriminate. The gods, recognizing his talent for aggressive enthusiasm, began deploying Ares to mortal conflicts. He was, they reasoned, uniquely suited to inspire mortals to stab each other more creatively. And indeed, once Ares stepped onto a battlefield, inspiration flowed like blood, mostly because it was blood. Ares took to war the way ducks take to water, loudly and with no concern for direction. He would arrive in a thunder of hoofbeats, surrounded by his charming entourage, Phobos, Panic, Deimos, Terror, Enyo, Bloodlust, and sometimes Eris, Discord, if she wasn't too busy flipping dinner tables in mortal households. Together they formed the original heavy metal band, minus the subtlety. Mortal soldiers, already stressed by hunger, mud, and being speared in the thighs, would look up and see a deity charging into the fray with a manic grin and a 6-foot sword. This, unsurprisingly, caused morale to dip. Whether he was fighting for their side or the other was immaterial. Ares' presence on a battlefield meant one thing: chaos had clocked in for the day. And yet, for all his dramatic entries and signature brand of indiscriminate mayhem, Ares had a dismal record. One would expect the god of war to, occasionally, win a war. He did not. Time and again, Ares fought heroically, noisily, and often shirtlessly, only to be driven back by mortals with slightly better plans and significantly better impulse control. The Trojan War stands as a prime example. Ares backed the Trojans. He thought it would be fun. They were doomed from the start, cursed by hubris and a large wooden horse. But Ares, never one to let logic interfere with chaos, joined anyway. He rampaged, bellowed, and even got injured by Diomedes, a mortal with a divinely sponsored grudge and excellent aim. Being wounded by a human was a low point. Ares, bleeding ichor and ego, retreated to Olympus, bellowing about injustice. Zeus told him to stop embarrassing the family. Athena rolled her eyes so hard it caused seismic activity in Thessaly. Even Apollo, normally polite to a fault, suggested Ares take a sabbatical, but Ares refused to quit. He was committed. If he couldn't be effective, he could at least be memorable. He began adding flair to his battlefield performances, screaming war cries that startled birds in neighboring countries, setting his own weapons on fire, painting his armor with ominous symbols that looked suspiciously like doodles. Theatrics, however, did not equate to success. He remained the god you called when you needed war to be louder, not better. Commanders began dreading his involvement. Oh no, Ares showed up again, became a common complaint filed in temple prayer boxes. Peasants referred to him as the Red Menace, or occasionally, that screaming nuisance with a sword. To bolster his resume, Ares diversified his brand. He dabbled in personal duels, arena combat, and even invented a few sports that involved head injuries. He declared the first war games, which mostly consisted of throwing javelins at each other and yelling. Surprisingly, no one thanked him. He attempted partnerships. Once, he teamed up with Eris to spark a regional conflict over a golden apple. The result? The Trojan War. Yes, that Trojan War. It all started with a dinner party snub and a fruit-based insult. Ares thought it was a delightful chain reaction. The rest of the gods called it a logistical nightmare. Not all his battles were external. Ares struggled with professional recognition. Athena, with her trophy wall of strategic victories, regularly received invitations to mortal academies, symposiums, and tasteful banquets. Ares, in contrast, was more often summoned by kings who kept him in the basement until they needed a cavalry boost. His career development was further hampered by a lack of administrative skills. While Athena codified battle ethics and military doctrines, Ares tried once to write a battle manual. It was 1 page long. The entire content read, "Hit harder." Public relations, too, were a disaster. Artists preferred sculpting Apollo or painting Artemis. Ares was difficult to capture because he refused to sit still and insisted on brandishing a weapon at all times. When depicted, he looked less like a noble warrior and more like someone who just lost a bet with a forge. There were attempts to rehabilitate his image. A temple official once suggested Ares try smiling in portraits. The resulting sculpture looked like he was about to punch the sculptor. Another time, a mortal playwright wrote a tragedy in which Ares was a misunderstood anti-hero. Ares attended opening night, declared it boring, and set the stage on fire. Still, mortals kept praying to him, not because they liked him, but because in the terrifying moments before battle, it helped to scream into the void and believe the void might scream back. Ares was that void, loud, angry, and extremely well armed. He did have admirers of a sort, mercenaries, warlords, and people who enjoyed lighting things on fire professionally. They named their sons after him and wore red into battle. A few even built statues with surprisingly accurate muscle definition. Ares noticed, briefly considered humility, then flexed until a pillar collapsed. One minor kingdom tried to appoint Ares as their official patron deity. The result was a 12-year civil war, 3 changes in leadership, and the accidental invention of flaming catapults. Ares called it a great success. The survivors renamed the city Not Worth It. Despite the mixed reviews, Ares never doubted his calling. He was not, strictly speaking, employed in the traditional sense. He had no salary, no schedule, and certainly no performance reviews. But he considered himself extremely busy. Every morning, he sharpened his spear, shouted at the horizon, and waited for the next excuse to rage into a battlefield like a divine bull in a bronze shop. Over time, his reputation became oddly dependable. He was the god of war, not because he won, but because he showed up every single time. Rain, shine, or siege tower, Ares arrived with wild eyes and poor judgment. While other gods debated morality or weighed consequences, Ares had already declared the battle begun by throwing a rock at the nearest soldier. The Olympians learned to tolerate him, much like one tolerates a very loud neighbor with questionable hobbies. He was, after all, family. He may have been the uncle who turned every barbecue into a fight club, but he was their uncle. At council meetings, Ares was given a seat, near the back, and ideally next to Dionysus, whose presence tended to mute everything around him. When asked for input, Ares typically growled something about honor, blood, and loyalty, then smashed a goblet for emphasis. The minutes from those meetings were largely unprintable. He once tried mentoring. A few enthusiastic mortals asked for his guidance in war. Ares agreed, led them to a battlefield, pointed at the enemy, and said, "Go." One survived, barely. The others were honored with very aggressive funerals. Even among his failures, there was a certain grim charm. Ares did not pretend. He was not a god of complexity. He did not wield nuance like a weapon or engage in philosophical debates. He was there to fight, to yell, to bleed, preferably on someone else's tunic. In a realm of layered motives and divine chessboards, Ares was the blunt instrument the gods reached for when things became too subtle. So yes, Ares was a mess, but he was a reliable mess. And as long as mortals kept inventing new ways to fight over goats, borders, and who looked at whom the wrong way, Ares would continue to show up. Not with solutions, but with volume. Because the story of war was far from over, and unfortunately, for just about everyone, in neither was his part in it. If war was Ares' profession, then love was his unsanctioned side hustle, the one that generated the most complaints, property damage, and temple-funded therapy sessions. It is worth noting that romance, for a god of war, was not so much a tender exploration of connection as it was a strategic misfire involving lust, jealousy, and occasional livestock stampedes. Unlike his half-siblings, who were known for poetic pursuits, romantic entanglements, or at least remembering the names of their partners, Ares approached love with the same tact he applied to battle, loudly, impulsively, and without the faintest grasp of long-term consequences. It should not be surprising, then, that his most infamous relationship was with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and frequently poor judgment. Aphrodite, legally married to Hephaestus, the god of smithing and unfortunate backstory symmetry, found Ares refreshingly stupid in a world of clever liars. He didn't pretend to be noble, he didn't write poetry, he never tried to seduce her with vague metaphors about the moon. He simply flexed, grunted something vaguely complimentary, and offered her a seat on his war chariot. Apparently, that worked. The affair was passionate, mostly in the sense that small countries were destabilized whenever they met. Their rendezvous were loud, frequent, and tactically reckless. They chose hiding spots that were only marginally private, behind columns, in partially lit shrines, and once, infamously, on a cloud directly above Mount Ida during peak festival season. Hephaestus, who may not have been charming, but was certainly detail-oriented, eventually installed a fine mesh net in their marital bed. Not a romantic gesture, just a trap. One fateful afternoon, Ares and Aphrodite, blinded by hormones and their shared disinterest and caution, fell for it. The net descended. They were caught, naked, together, mid-romp. Naturally, Hephaestus invited the entire pantheon to witness the scene, because divine shaming is best conducted with snacks and a full audience. Gods and goddesses gathered around the disgraced couple like critics at a particularly awkward performance art exhibit. Apollo laughed so hard he dropped his lyre. Hera looked vaguely pleased. Poseidon, bafflingly, offered to pay Hephaestus for the net. The scandal became the subject of plays, poems, and pottery. Mortals immortalized the moment with questionable anatomy and exaggerated facial expressions. Ares, humiliated, did the only thing he knew how to do, threatened everyone with immediate and disproportionate violence. Unfortunately, divine contracts protected most of them. He was forced to sulk. Despite the catastrophic embarrassment, the affair continued. Subtlety remained elusive. They conducted their relationship like a siege, bold, chaotic, and surrounded by a lot of screaming. They had children, many children, too many children. Some were personifications of battlefield byproducts, like Phobos, fear, and Deimos, terror. Others seem to have been named during a hangover. There was Harmonia, a curious accident of harmony emerging from a union of discord. The irony was so potent, it nearly imploded a temple. Then came Eros, the original Cupid, who wielded the power of love the way his father wielded a mace, blindly and with shocking collateral damage. Not all of Ares' romantic ventures were with fellow deities. He occasionally dabbled in mortal affairs, quite literally. This usually resulted in children, drama, and minor wars. Ares did not believe in ghosting. He believed in personally starting a skirmish near the village of his most recent ex just to feel something. Take Oenomaus, for example. Ares fathered him with a mortal princess and left behind a child who would go on to become a king, a chariot enthusiast, and a noted sociopath. Another was Diomedes, a different one than the guy who stabbed him, who kept man-eating horses and a charming absence of ethics. Ares' legacy among mortals was less a proud lineage and more an intergenerational warning. To Ares, love was adrenaline with better lighting. He didn't seek connection, just combustion. He wasn't so much vulnerable as he was intermittently distracted by hormones, commitment was a battlefield he had no map for. Intimacy required a kind of emotional reconnaissance he found exhausting and probably for cowards. This is not to say he lacked emotion. Aries felt things intensely all the time, mostly anger, occasionally desire, rarely introspection. When Aphrodite toyed with other gods, which she often did, out of boredom, vengeance, or sheer sport, Aries would react by flipping siege towers or hurling javelins at clouds. His rage was as predictable as it was unproductive. He once tried writing a love poem. It read, "Your eyes remind me of blood." He set it on fire after realizing it rhymed accidentally. Olympus didn't take his romantic endeavors seriously. Why would they? Ares, the eternal man-child with a spear, falling in and out of love like it was a bar fight. Hermes once described his love life as a flaming chariot rolling downhill into a bouquet of knives. Athena, when asked, simply muttered something about Darwinism and walked away. In truth, Ares had one tragic flaw in love. He wanted to be adored for who he was, but who he was tended to cause small civilizations to collapse. He craved loyalty, passion, even tenderness, but his methods included shouting and dramatic exits. He believed love should hurt, and he was usually the one holding the weapon. When spurned, Ares did not mope. He retaliated. Hearts weren't broken, they were trampled underfoot and possibly set ablaze. One former lover attempted to move on by marrying a lesser river god. The next day, that river god mysteriously developed a waterfall that screamed. Despite the destruction, some still pursued him. He had appeal, the kind found in glossy paintings of dangerous men with commitment issues. Mortals fantasized about him. Poets romanticized him. Artists painted him lounging in armor, muscles glistening, eyes smoldering with the subtle promise of emotional unavailability. Temples dedicated to Ares often included a side chamber for those seeking love, which made no theological sense, but a great deal of narrative irony. People left offerings of roses, swords, and very confused prayers. Some swore their passionate entanglements improved, others just disappeared. There was also the minor matter of his relationship with his sister Eris. Not romantic, think every pantheon, but alarmingly codependent. Eris, goddess of discord, often appeared wherever Ares did, egging him on, stirring trouble, and then vanishing before consequences were distributed. Some theorized that their emotional dynamic formed the original blueprint for all toxic friend groups. Ares never learned, or rather, he never wanted to. Love, like war, wasn't something to be learned. It was something to be charged at, face first, preferably while yelling. Subtlety was treason. Sensitivity was for people who liked poetry. He gave what he had: fire, fury, and the occasional bouquet of spears. So he marched from lover to lover, sometimes adored, sometimes feared, never truly understood. His relationships were wreckage-strewn battlefields in their own right, full of passionate declarations and emotionally scorched earth. And while the other gods whispered and gossiped, Ares stood tall, convinced that love, like combat, should always leave a mark. He once tried therapy, just once. The therapist quit after 10 minutes, citing irreconcilable differences with the client's energy. Ares also attempted love potions. He drank one by mistake and fell in love with his own reflection for 3 weeks. Narcissus, observing from the underworld, was reportedly both flattered and alarmed. there were minor attempts to set him up with more suitable matches. A matchmaking nymph once curated a list of emotionally stable river goddesses and quiet forest spirits. Ares brought a battle axe to the first date. There was no second. Still, he returned to Aphrodite again and again. Not because she was good for him, but because she was good with him. She understood destruction, and in a way, they danced through ruins rather than lived among them. When they weren't driving entire towns into chaos, they were oddly comfortable, a war god and a love goddess sharing olives on a scorched balcony. Their love was never meant to be tidy. It was not aspirational, but it was consistent, in the same way storms are consistent, loud, messy, and strangely reassuring to those who like noise. And so Ares remained, a tragic romantic in armor, chasing passion like it owed him a debt. He ruined dinners, disrupted weddings, and occasionally tried to woo someone by demonstrating sword techniques. But he never gave up, because despite the carnage, Ares believed in love, the same way he believed in battle, fiercely, recklessly, and with the absolute certainty that it should always leave a crater. And there were still plenty of craters left to make. If there was one thing the Olympians loved more than meddling in mortal affairs or throwing banquets that ended in curses, it was managing their image. Public opinion mattered, especially when temples required maintenance, festivals needed attendance, and priests had to justify your divine relevance. Ares, however, had the unfortunate habit of treating reputation like he treated everything else, as an optional accessory occasionally set on fire. Among the gods, Ares was already considered a bit of a social liability. He didn't strategize like Athena, charm like Apollo, or even maintain grudges as elegantly as Hera. He simply charged headfirst into everything with a bloodthirsty grin and no backup plan, which was a branding problem because nobody wanted their patron god to sound like a cautionary tale with biceps. In the beginning, the ancient Greeks had tried. There were temples erected in his name, rituals performed to curry his favor before battle, and hymns written that tried very hard to make slaughter sound poetic. But despite their efforts, Ares never developed the glowing public image enjoyed by his flashier counterparts. If Olympus was a high school yearbook, he would have been voted most likely to break a table mid-conversation. It didn't help that his battlefield performance was, at best, a mixed bag. Yes, he was the god of war, but no one specified whether that meant successful war. On several key occasions, Ares lost to mortals, not metaphorically, physically, sometimes with bruises. Diomedes, a mortal hero with a slight grudge and a solid arm, once stabbed him in the gut. Athena, his half-sister and eternal PR nemesis, mocked him for weeks. The story made its way to bards and was eventually included in song, pottery, and awkward wedding toasts. Image consultants read desperate minor deities with parchment and bad ideas, advised a soft rebrand. Maybe lean into the protective aspect of war. Highlight the courage, the valor, the shield more than the sword. Ares nodded solemnly and then punched a bard through a temple wall for using the phrase, nuanced masculine energy. The bard survived, barely. The rebrand did not. Then came the festivals. Festivals were PR gold. Everyone loved a good Dionysian party, and even Hades got some decent attention during the annual days of mourning. So Ares tried to organize a few events in his own honor. It was meant to be a celebration of strength, bravery and absolutely not public maiming. What actually happened was the first annual games of unrestrained valor, which resulted in 14 broken amphorae, 2 flattened oxen, and a minor regional fire. No one could locate the flautist afterward. The second year was worse. Somewhere between the javelin toss and the friendly siege reenactment, the town council of Sparta voted to quietly relocate the festivities to a safer, less war-adjacent god. Apollo was selected. There were fewer screams, more lyres. Meanwhile, mortals were growing tired of Ares' brand of chaos. Farmers didn't like it when their harvest was trampled during divine temper tantrums. Mother frowned upon their sons being conscripted by dreams featuring blood-soaked armor and motivational yelling. Even generals began offering sacrifices to other gods before battle, hoping that strategy might outperform brute force just this once. Ares, of course, didn't understand the problem. He was being himself. What else was there to be? His temples became less frequented. His statues collected moss. One of them was repurposed as a scarecrow. Even his own priests started carrying insurance. Desperate for a reputation boost, Ares once considered doing something charitable. But as it turned out, handing out weapons to orphans was not widely seen as philanthropic. In another attempt, he declared he would be the patron of gladiator schools, hoping to inspire discipline and honor. Instead, it inspired a thriving underground gambling ring and at least one theater production called Blood for Breakfast, a tragedy in 4 screams. Athena, ever the tactician, capitalized on his blunders. She positioned herself as the goddess of just war, wisdom, and strategic victory. Her temples flourished. Her name was spoken with reverence. Ares' name, meanwhile, was invoked mostly during stubbed toes and battle cries that immediately preceded someone getting hit in the face. There was also the problem of his entourage. Phobos and Deimos, the twin embodiments of panic and dread, were not exactly morale boosters. They followed Ares into battle like overzealous interns at a demolition company. Mortals claimed their mere presence turned men mad. Marketing surveys were inconclusive, mostly because the surveyors kept screaming and throwing themselves into rivers. Then there was Enyo, goddess of destruction and possible pyromaniac, who was often mistaken for his PR manager, simply because she carried scrolls and shouted less. In truth, she was more like the unpaid consultant who kept suggesting arson. The few mortal kings who openly worshipped Ares tended to meet dramatic ends. There was Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, and Ares' daughter, who was slain by Achilles in an act of tragic poetry. Then Capaneus, who defied Zeus and was promptly turned into a cautionary thunderbolt statistic. Ares backed them all. Ares lost them all. Mortals noticed. A temple in Thebes tried to modernize his image by commissioning a fresco of Ares looking thoughtful and majestic. The artist, inspired by optimism and mild hallucinations, painted him reclining with a scroll and a wistful gaze. Ares hated it. He set the temple on fire. The public response was mixed. Some niche cults tried reimagining him as a complex symbol of internal struggle, the eternal warrior within. These cults were largely run by poets, masochists, and that one group in Corinth who wore iron sandals to achieve spiritual blisters. Ares appreciated the effort, but did not attend their rituals, mostly because they took place in candlelit basements that smelled like burnt figs. Even the myths did him no favors. Most narratives cast him as the easily enraged, emotionally stunted uncle of Olympus. He showed up, swung a weapon, bled dramatically, and exited with a loud grunt. No one gave him a soliloquy. No one offered character depth. Hephaestus, a blacksmith, had more plot development. The playwright Euripides once tried to write Ares into a more nuanced role in a lost tragedy titled Ares at Dusk. It was pulled from the festival after a test audience began laughing during the war god's monologue on loneliness. The script was reworked into a comedy called Helmet Problems. Desperate to control the narrative, Ares attempted to sponsor an oracle. The idea was simple: prophetic endorsements. Unfortunately, oracles tend to say whatever the fumes tell them to, and his picked oracle developed a habit of prophesying doom every time someone offered him olives. The campaign failed. His worst PR decision, however, involved commissioning a heroic ballad written entirely by himself. It included such lines as, "My spear is longer than yours, and courage tastes like blood, and I drink deeply." Aphrodite described it as alarmingly sincere. Hermes laughed so hard he sprained something. Still, Ares persisted, not because he believed in PR, but because he was stubborn and mildly offended that fewer mortals screamed his name during thunderstorms. He tried making guest appearances in other gods' domains. He offered to guard Apollo's temple. Apollo declined. He volunteered as Artemis's hunting partner. She shot him twice. In one especially desperate moment, he considered hosting a symposium on war ethics. It lasted 8 minutes. No one took notes, but perhaps the cruelest twist was that Ares was not irrelevant. Far from it. Mortals kept waging wars. Armies marched. Shields clashed. The world, tragically, remained full of violence. But they didn't thank him for it. They credited tactics. They built monuments to generals. They held up treaties as triumphs. War had become political, moral, even civilized, and nothing about Ares was civilized. He was war in its rawest form. The scream, the charge, the chaos. Not the aftermath, not the treaty signing ceremony, not the parade. And so, as Olympus celebrated yet another festival in Athena's honor, with garlands and wise speeches and children pretending to be owls, Ares stood on the edge of the gathering, watching, uninvited, undeterred. He was, as always, shirtless and scowling. Because say what they would, he wasn't going anywhere. Reputation was for those who needed approval. Ares didn't need to be liked. He didn't even need to be remembered fondly. He just needed to be felt. In bruises, in broken weapons, in the silence after the roar. And besides, there was still one part of the story left to tell. And reputations, like helmets, could always be dented back into shape. Tomorrow, maybe, someone would finally get it right. Or at the very least, bleed trying. Time, for the gods, is a strange and inconsistent punishment. Immortal beings are not supposed to fear obscurity, yet somehow Ares managed to fall victim to that most modern of divine tragedies, irrelevance. He, who once inspired fear across battlefields, caused generals to weep at the sight of a red sky, and personally funded the first dozen helmet designs, now found himself quietly fading from memory like an expired war bond. It started, as all things do, with the Romans. The empire that prided itself on roads, architecture, and expanding into places nobody asked it to, took one look at the Greek pantheon and said, "We can work with this, but let's make it more organized. Enter Mars, not a new god per se, but a heavily edited version of Ares. Like Ares had been through a military PR firm, 2 branding consultants, and a rigorous etiquette class. Where Ares was chaotic, Mars was disciplined. Where Ares had the strategic finesse of a thrown brick, Mars was civic-minded, patriotic, and capable of discussing troop formations without screaming. The Romans adored him. He had temples, cults, feast days, and statues that didn't look like they were mid-tantrum. Ares, meanwhile, became the awkward prototype nobody wanted to admit had been in charge first. It didn't help that Ares' Greek reputation was already less than stellar. Philosophers had long considered him the spiritual equivalent of a bar brawl, loud, regrettable, and unlikely to end well. Plato described him as necessary in limited doses, which is also how ancient medics described hemlock. Historians reduced him to a footnote, a cautionary tale of what happens when a deity refuses to develop a second hobby. Artists weren't any kinder. Early depictions of Ares were muscular, sure, but also almost always confused. Painters couldn't decide if he was supposed to be noble or just shirtless and shouting. Later periods gave up entirely and just painted Mars instead. If Ares appeared at all, it was in the background, frequently being stabbed, scolded, or forgotten mid-scene. Even the cults were lackluster. His few remaining worshippers were mostly fringe types, sword collectors, angry poets, and people who thought declaring war on their HOA counted as a religious rite. Their temples were less sacred space and more dangerous shed with live steel. Occasionally, one of them would attempt a revival ritual. It never worked. At best, a pigeon would explode. Ares tried to rebrand. He really did. For a few decades, he attempted to associate himself with martial arts, hoping to become the god of controlled violence rather than just loud violence. He appeared in a few dreams wearing a gi, mispronounced dojo, and was promptly mistaken for a motivational speaker with anger issues. He retreated. There was also a brief, ill-fated partnership with Nike, the goddess of victory, not the shoe company. Ares thought they could form a new dynamic duo, war and triumph, power and success. Nike disagreed. She told him, gently, that victory required more than just screaming and an axe. She also pointed out that he had a tendency to flinch when things got intellectual. Desperate, Ares once attempted to align himself with sports. Surely, he reasoned, the battlefield of modern man was the stadium. Unfortunately, the gods of athletics had already formed their own chaotic fraternity, and they considered Ares to be off-brand. He was too much blood, not enough branding. Besides, he kept trying to give pep talks that ended in brawls, so he lingered, not banished, not dead, just ignored. The divine equivalent of an outdated operating system, technically present, but not compatible with anything. Olympus had long since moved on. Zeus was still narcissistic, but now in a more performative, social media-ready way. Athena had become the patron saint of think pieces. Apollo started a podcast. Ares tried that too. It was called Warrior Wisdom, and it lasted 3 episodes. The first was mostly grunting. The second was just him yelling about how helmets were for cowards. The third ended abruptly when he challenged the microphone to single combat. Reviews were not kind, and yet, despite his cultural fall from grace, Ares remained. Because irrelevance, like war, is not always final. Somewhere, someone was always angry enough to summon him. A bar fight gone nuclear, a protest turned riot, a soccer match that ended with 4 hospitalizations and a flaming vuvuzela. These were his modern temples. Historians occasionally name-dropped him, but only as a metaphor. Ares was no longer a god, but a symbol of wrath, of pointless aggression, of that one guy in the group project who wants to fight the professor. He had become shorthand for what not to be. In a way, it was a form of immortality, just not the good kind. There were, of course, still some places where his image held sway. Video games, for instance, loved him. Developers found endless delight in programming Ares as a boss character, huge, loud, always carrying a sword the size of a canoe. He was never the hero, of course. He was the mid-level threat you had to beat before the story got interesting. Oddly enough, Ares found a strange comfort in this digital afterlife. Pixels didn't mock him. Avatars didn't laugh when he fell off a chariot. In a world of 1S and 0S, his rage was still useful. It didn't matter if he had no character arc or moral growth. Nobody expected that anymore. Museums also did their part in preserving his memory, though rarely with enthusiasm. Tour guides refer to him as a lesser Olympian or a bit of a problem child. His statues were often tucked between more beloved figures, like Athena or Dionysus, with labels that read Ares, god of war, controversial. Children pointed and giggled. Adults snapped selfies with him, ironically. Philosophers, those ancient enemies, continued to ignore him. They preferred Athena for strategy, Hermes for wit, even Dionysus for existential insight via intoxication. Ares didn't make the syllabus. When asked about the god of war, most students assumed he was a rejected Marvel character. Even mythology textbooks became more dismissive. He was the embodiment of conflict, but not much else. His role was functional but uninspired. One particularly brutal edition described him as a divine placeholder until Rome figured out how to properly weaponize patriotism. So what then was Ares' legacy? Was it the shattered shields littering ancient battlefields? The children named after emotions better suited to horror films than baby registries? The lingering fear that rage, once loosed, is impossible to cage again? Or was it something smaller, more pathetic? A lesson in how power without purpose eventually eats itself. Ares never stopped being. He just stopped mattering. He became a relic, a whisper, a cautionary tale with abs, and he knew it. That was the worst part. Gods are not meant for self-reflection, but even Ares could glance in a polished shield and see the outline of what used to be important. Now, not so much. But still, there were moments, fleeting, ridiculous moments where his presence surged. A keyboard warrior hurling insults on a forum. A driver in traffic muttering war chants at the steering wheel. A teenager in a backyard swinging a stick like it was a sword, declaring war on imaginary empires. These were not altars exactly, but they were echoes. And Ares, being Ares, was not inclined to go gently. Obsolescence might have claimed his name, but not his instinct. He still snarled at thunder, still flexed in bronze reflections, still waited for that one fool who would call him forth again, by accident or on purpose. Chaos is patient. In the end, Ares' story wasn't a tragedy. That would imply pathos and learning. It wasn't a triumph either, obviously. If anything, it was a very long, very loud rage quit stretched across millennia. And like all true rage quits, it wasn't about losing. It was about refusing to admit defeat while the screen fades to black. So he stands, somewhere between myth and meme, defiant to the end. Forgotten by scholars, mocked by children, reimagined by teenagers with too much testosterone and not enough supervision. He is a legacy without lesson, thunder without storm, a war god without a war. And in the right bar, on the wrong night, if someone throws the first punch, you might just feel him watching, still armed, still shirtless, still furious,